Alright fellas, last night we saw a ton of interesting names from the MMA world return, but debatably the most interesting of them all was the boxing debut of Tony Ferguson fighting the seasoned influencer boxer Salt Papi. I think alike to a lot of you, when I saw this announcement I gritted my teeth. Tony, coming off an 8-fight losing streak, seemed to be being fed to the influencer world as just a big name to be brutally KO'd. But he surprisingly proved us all wrong. So, I want to talk about how this fight came about, Tony's performance, and a bit about, well, what's next for him. But just before we break that all down, if you don't know, my name's Close and I make videos on fight sports as it happens to keep you informed, so make sure to subscribe and I'll always keep you in the loop. Now, old MMA fighters and boxing is usually something which doesn't go together. The age-old story at this point is old MMA fighter goes against young influencer, the young influencer isn't much of an influencer and has the skills of an okay amateur boxer, those skills trump the no boxing ability of the MMA fighter, and the MMA fighter usually ends up knocked out. And that's kinda what we expected here. Tony Ferguson to everyone seemed way past it, and really he should have been long retired. And from an outside perspective, before the fight, this was a pretty sad thing to see. Tony is loved by most of the MMA community, and then to see him go from top level UFC to being fed to a fella named Salt Papi, it made a lot of fight fans not that happy. But as Tony wanted to keep fighting, these fights would be the ones which would offer him the biggest payday. So on that front, it just made sense. For Misfits, having Tony Ferguson on this card was a massive acquisition. Misfits, over the last 12 months, really has been losing its relevance a bit. Going from cards where everyone knew the influencers to cards where people didn't really know a single name. So this event is a part of that resurgence. It was sink or swim for Misfits, and at the moment it seems like they're back on the right track. Having names like Darren Till, Dilon Danis and Joey Essex on one card as well as Ferguson is exactly what Misfits needs right now to capture that wide audience and get people interested again. And although some of the other fights like the Till fight seemed pretty competitive, this Ferguson fight really didn't seem so. Salt Papi at this point really doesn't seem like much of an influencer, he's more of a crossover boxer if anything. So we were all expecting it to go one way. Yet once the fight started, I think most people were surprised to see Ferguson on the front foot and throwing decent shots. For a bloke mainly with a wrestling background, he seemed to have decent boxing skills, his stance was decent, he had decent hand speed, and he just looked way better than anyone was expecting. But the same can't be said for Salt Papi, his game plan truly wasn't great. He was successful when he tried to jab a bit more and was continuously moving, but then he got tired, and for Salt Papi, when he seems to get tired, he finds himself on the ropes or in the corner, trying to just find a powerful counter. And what helped tire out Salt even more was basically the whole fight he was only throwing one shot at a time, and very rarely two, with all of them being full force power shots just draining his energy. And with him putting all the chips in on these power shots, I think he massively underestimated Tony's chin. And after a couple rounds of this strategy, Tony got a decent read on Salt. And Salt, he just didn't change up anything. Additionally, Tony was also smart enough to invest in the body through those early rounds. In effect, he just slowed Salt down even further. And not only that, he was also landing decent shots up top too. And by round 3, Salt honestly looked exhausted and Tony took advantage, having Salt on the ropes for almost the whole round. This resulted in Tony eventually stunning Salt, which allowed him to land an absolute barrage of punches on him with no return. The referee jumped in and finally, after years, Tony Ferguson was once again a winner. I was pretty happy to see him finally get a win and almost relieved he didn't get knocked out. He honestly proved all of us wrong and is now technically 1-0 in the boxing world. Yet of course with this win there was a bit of controversy saying it was an early stoppage. Was it an early stoppage? Yeah, but at the same time I can see why the ref stepped in. You have an influencer fighter, clearly gassed, on the ropes for the whole round, borderline just throwing Hail Mary counters. He gets kinda rocked and then doesn't answer to a flurry of punches. It was pretty early, but I'm not completely appalled by it. I think if the fight were to continue, we would have probably seen it continue to swing further and further in Tony's favour. Yet regardless of the stoppage, this was a fight that Salt should have and could have won, but his game plan and conditioning just let him down. He looked like he just wasn't in good shape. He looked like he fought through 12 rounds after the second. That's not good, and having only one game plan of throw heavy counters quite clearly just wasn't enough. I've seen a lot of people saying, well, Tony won against a TikToker, why is that impressive? Now, Salt Papi, in my opinion, isn't really a TikToker anymore. For the last 3-4 years, he's supposedly been living and training like a full-time boxer. This has seemed like his full-time gig, being a fighter for Misfits. You probably don't know him for his content, you probably know him from Misfits. So for Tony coming across and winning against one of the better fighters in the crossover scene in his first ever boxing bout is a pretty impressive feat. And if I'm Salt Papi's trainer, I would be questioning, what are we doing? Your fighter almost has no stamina after a few rounds. If he's been training full time for years, there's either a discipline or a training issue. But I'll let you guys decide in the comments. For Ferguson though, after this win, he's going to experience a bit of a career revival. He's still a big name, he's just proved he can hang with some of the best in the crossover boxing scene. Ferguson also walked away from this fight with the Misfits boxing middleweight interim title. If he decides to continue down the Misfits route, he can find himself in the ring against the actual titleist Anis Gibb, who holds that full title. In terms of making a big fight, this makes sense and would be somewhat interesting to see. Yet the main problem with this fight would be money. Both sides would want to get paid, and I would somewhat expect Anis Gibb and maybe Ferguson to price themselves out of a potential bout. With Anis Gibb, he fought Slim because of the Qatari investment. There was external investment, and that justified that fight happening. Could this potential fight earn enough money to warrant their paydays? Probably not, but I guess we'll see. Another potential fight for Ferguson is fighting Dilon Danis in an MMA fight. Probably in potentially Misfit MMA's first event. They were meant to fight earlier this year in another promotion, but that was cancelled as seemingly the promotion went under. The pair did face off after Tony's bout. It was incredibly polite and respectful, but honestly I can't really see this happening. Once again, probably because of a money issue. Although, would have I expected Ferguson versus Salt? No. So, although I wouldn't expect these two bouts to actually happen, expect the unexpected. And if it's not those two bouts, I wouldn't be surprised to see Ferguson end up heading some US Misfits card against some other old MMA fighter, as there's absolutely a few that I'm sure would be happy to jump in the ring as long as the money's right. And another fight I wouldn't be surprised to see, if KSI decides to return, would be against KSI. They're around the same weight, Tony's a big name, he's just put up a good performance against Salt. It kinda makes sense for a KSI return, but as I just said before with the other ones, I guess we will see what happens. Now, as always, I want to hear what you think. What were your thoughts on Ferguson's return? What do you think is next? And any other thoughts on the whole event, I want to hear in the comments down below. And also, if you enjoyed the video, please make sure to like and subscribe. It really does a ton to help the channel. Yeah, thanks for watching, fellas, and I'll catch you in the next one.